The name Falcon Dynamics shimmered on the glass of the tallest tower in downtown Chicago, synonymous with power, innovation, and prestige. Its sleek offices were home to billion-dollar deals, whispered partnerships, and cutting-edge technologies that shaped industries across the globe. But behind the pristine glass walls and boardrooms filled with tailored suits and curated smiles, there was a truth long buried beneath layers of silence. A truth that began, as most seismic shifts do, in contradiction. For over 3 decades, Denise Morgan passed through the same security gates as any visitor to Falcon Dynamics, quietly presenting her outdated guest badge. No one ever questioned why a woman in her early 50s, dark-skinned, plainly dressed, and carrying a worn leather bag, showed up at every annual shareholders meeting, sat silently at the back of the auditorium, and left without shaking hands or posing for photos. The lobby guards never asked if she needed help. Receptionists never offered her coffee or even eye contact. Her name was never on the press list, and no one at the executive level knew who she was, or so they believed. What they didn't know was that she had helped build the very foundation they now stood upon. Denise Morgan was no ordinary investor. She had once been one of the most brilliant engineering minds of her generation. Graduating valedictorian from Spelman College in the early 1990s, she earned accolades not just for her academic excellence, but for her relentless drive and integrity. In an era where women of color were routinely denied funding, mentorship, and recognition, Denise carved her own space in the shadows of the tech world, letting her work speak when the world refused to listen. It was at a struggling tech convention in 1991 that Denise met Samuel Falcon, a white graduate from Northwestern University whose dream of launching an ethical, human-centered technology firm had already been rejected by a dozen investors. Samuel had intelligence, but not the hands-on skill or trust of engineers. Denise had both. After a 3-hour conversation over lukewarm coffee and half-eaten bagels, they shook hands and formed a quiet alliance, one built not on image, but on trust. From a rented warehouse on the south side, the two worked day and night, Denise soldering circuit boards and writing code, while Samuel pitched prototypes to venture capitalists who only saw legitimacy when he spoke. They knew that if her name were listed on the founding documents, the funding would dry up. The industry wasn't ready for a black woman as a tech visionary. And so, with equal parts pain and pragmatism, Denise made a choice that would define the next 30 years of her life. She signed an agreement with Samuel Falcon, handwritten, notarized, and later registered discreetly, that she would retain 51% of the company's shares, held in her name but hidden from the public. Samuel would be the sole public face, the CEO, the man in the headlines. Denise would remain behind the curtain, never photographed, never quoted, never acknowledged in the corporate family tree. Time moved on. Falcon Dynamics grew from a dusty startup to a titan in AI-powered infrastructure, and Samuel kept his promise. He sent monthly updates. He consulted her privately on major decisions. He never once betrayed the pact they had formed when no one else believed in them. But the world changed faster than people did. And when Samuel died suddenly from a heart attack, everything shifted. The company passed to his son, Bradley Falcon, a Harvard-educated heir raised in penthouses and fundraisers, trained to manage empires, not preserve legacies. Bradley never knew the full truth. To him, Denise was just an odd name buried in the old shareholder registry, a minor figure with negligible influence. The truth was, he never bothered to ask. And so for 10 more years, Denise remained invisible, even as her own company transformed into a symbol of elite tech culture. While Bradley held court at shareholder galas, Denise walked the long hallway outside the boardroom without ever being invited in. She watched the vision she helped build become a playground for privilege, where diversity was a bullet point and values were negotiable. But Denise remembered everything. Every line of code, every contract clause, every handshake and betrayal. And in that invisibility, she gathered not just facts, but power. She had never needed the world to validate her presence. She had only been waiting for the right moment to be seen. And now, it was almost time. After Samuel Falcon's sudden passing, the boardroom of Falcon Dynamics entered a new era, one not of quiet vision, but of loud dominance. The transition of power was swift. Samuel's only son, Bradley Falcon, was ushered into the role of CEO with glowing headlines and investor excitement. Barely 35, Bradley embodied everything the modern corporate world adored. Ivy League credentials, inherited wealth, sharp suits, and the smug confidence of someone who had never truly earned the ground beneath his feet. To the public, Falcon Dynamics appeared to be entering its golden age. Under Bradley's direction, the company rolled out aggressive expansion strategies, flashy product launches, and billion-dollar mergers. But beneath the sleek branding and performance charts, a corrosive culture had taken root. The boardroom, once a space where Samuel and Denise had debated quietly about ethics and innovation, had now become a temple of unchecked ambition. No one spoke of long-term stability. The only metrics that mattered were market dominance, quarterly profits, and executive bonuses. Bradley surrounded himself with people who mirrored his own image: young, white, male, and unbothered by the burden of legacy. The few women and people of color who made it past middle management rarely stayed long. The old engineers who had been with Falcon Dynamics since the warehouse days were gradually edged out under the guise of restructuring. Even the reception area had been remodeled to reflect a new ethos: clean lines, cold marble, and a digital wall that streamed the company's stock price in real time. The soul of Falcon Dynamics had been replaced by a spectacle of power. Inside the executive suites, laughter came easily, usually at someone else's expense. Shareholders who raised questions about equity or transparency were privately mocked. "This isn't a charity," Bradley once quipped during a meeting, sipping from a crystal tumbler. "If people want fairness, they can join a book club." It was in this atmosphere of arrogance and consolidation that the emergency board meeting was called. A Wednesday morning in October dawned gray and unforgiving as shareholders gathered in Falcon Dynamics' glass-walled conference room on the 44th floor. The Chicago skyline stretched endlessly outside, cold and distant. Inside, the temperature was no warmer. The boardroom, illuminated by recessed lighting and ringed with high-backed leather chairs, hummed with anticipation. Bradley, flanked by his inner circle, sat at the head of the table, fingers drumming rhythmically on the polished walnut surface. The agenda was simple but brutal: a sweeping layoff plan targeting over 600 employees across multiple departments. On paper, it was a strategic realignment for fiscal efficiency. In truth, it was a mass execution disguised as corporate prudence. Entire teams, R&D, support, long-serving admin staff were on the chopping block. The cost savings would be funneled into a stock buyback scheme and a performance bonus pool for senior executives. No one in the room questioned the ethics. No one asked about severance or job retraining. They discussed people's livelihoods the same way they'd discuss outdated servers, an unnecessary cost burden. As Bradley clicked through a slick PowerPoint titled "Streamlining the Future," the board members nodded in sync, occasionally chuckling at internal jokes about cutting the fat and refocusing talent on ROI-driven roles. Even the language of the meeting betrayed the reality. There were no humans being let go, only resource units. No families, no faces, just numbers on a spreadsheet. A few minority shareholders had dialed in remotely, their voices tentative and nearly ignored. When one elderly man timidly raised concerns about the disproportionate impact the cuts would have on Black and Latino staff, Bradley gave a performative smile. "Duly noted," he said, not even glancing at the screen. "Let's stay focused on the numbers, shall we?" The entire room reeked of entitlement. This wasn't just a board meeting. It was a coronation of power disguised in quarterly forecasts and legalese. The board, composed entirely of wealthy white men and a few compliant allies, moved to vote on the layoff package with barely any discussion. To them, dissent wasn't just inconvenient, it was irrelevant. No one noticed the quiet footsteps approaching the boardroom door. No one wondered if a new name might challenge the tide. The decision seemed preordained, but history rarely asks for permission before entering. Just as Bradley Falcon prepared to call for a final vote, one that would trigger massive layoffs and tighten his grip over Falcon Dynamics, the boardroom door opened with a quiet but assertive creak. Every head in the room turned, eyes narrowing with confusion and mild irritation. The last thing they expected was an interruption, especially not from the person who now stepped inside, a black woman in her early 50s, dressed in simple office attire. She wore a navy cardigan, cream blouse and sensible flats. No visible ID badge, no designer accessories, no briefcase or tablet in hand. Just a worn leather folder held close to her chest. One executive arched a brow. Another scoffed under his breath. Someone get facilities, she's clearly in the wrong room. Bradley didn't even glance up from his tablet. "Ma'am, this is a closed session. Kindly return to reception," he said, his tone as icy as the glass of water beside him. But the woman didn't stop. With calm, deliberate steps, she approached the center of the room, ignoring the looks, the smirks, the whispered jabs. She reached the head of the long mahogany table and, without a word, placed the thick folder on the glass surface. The soft thud it made was oddly commanding. A low chuckle emerged from the back of the room. "Wrong room, lady. Shareholders only," one man said, amused. Another added, probably delivering a lost document or looking for janitorial. Still, the woman said nothing. She simply stood there, her posture straight, her eyes steady, not confrontational, just deeply assured. Bradley finally looked up, visibly irritated. "Security?" he called out, waving his hand dismissively. "This isn't the time for interruptions." But before the guards could move, Martha Green, the board's longest-serving member and former legal advisor to the founder, raised a hand. Her gaze had locked on the folder. Something about its age, its worn corners, and the red legal seals piqued her instinct. "Wait," she said, leaning forward. "What's in that file?" The woman spoke at last, her voice calm and unwavering. "The truth you've all ignored for 30 years. Without waiting for permission, she opened the folder and slid several pages toward the board members. They included notarized documents, original stock certificates, and a legally binding agreement signed by Samuel Falcon, transferring 51% ownership of Falcon Dynamics to one Denise Morgan. At the top of the file sat a handwritten letter in Samuel's distinct, looping script. Martha reached for the papers and began reviewing them, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned each page, verifying signatures, seals, and legal phrasing that only someone familiar with the company's early years would recognize. The rest of the room fell into an uneasy silence as more board members leaned in to get a better look. Bradley rose from his seat, face red with disbelief. "This is a joke, right? These can't be real." He turned toward his executive assistant. "Get legal in here, now." Then, to Denise, he snapped, "What scam are you running, lady? Where did you even get those documents?" Denise didn't flinch. She looked him directly in the eye and replied, 30 years ago, I co-founded this company with your father. When Falcon Dynamics was nothing but an idea and a failing prototype, Samuel and I worked side by side. I was the one who helped him secure the first round of payroll when every investor turned him down. He didn't have equity to give, so he gave me ownership. But he also knew what the world would think of a black woman with a majority stake. So we made an agreement, quiet, legal, and carefully documented. Laughter died in Bradley's throat. He stood frozen for a moment, then suddenly erupted. "This is a lie. My father would never do something like that behind the board's back. She's lying. This is all forged." But Martha's voice, clear and steady, broke through the rising tension. "These documents are legitimate. I remember Samuel discussing a silent partner in the company's earliest days. I always assumed it was a private funder. I never knew her name." She turned to Denise, "And you're her." Denise gave a quiet nod. "I never asked for publicity. I asked only for the promise to be kept. And for 30 years, I waited. I watched this company rise and fall, watched the values we built get replaced by ego and greed. I stayed silent, thinking perhaps things would correct themselves. But now I see they won't. That's why I'm here." Legal advisors from the company's counsel arrived and began reviewing the documents under Martha's supervision. They compared registration numbers with archived files, verified the authenticity of signatures, and called the original law firm listed on the shareholder agreement, one that, luckily, still had scanned records in its digital vault. After an hour of tense verification, the head counsel looked up and addressed the room. "These documents are authentic. Miss Morgan's ownership is legally binding and enforceable. She holds a controlling 51% share in Falcon Dynamics." A stunned silence descended. Even the most skeptical board members now looked pale. Bradley's usual smirk had vanished. "This is a setup," he stammered. We can fight this. She has no experience in leadership, no authority. I won't allow this company to fall into chaos." Denise remained calm. "You've already let that happen, Bradley. I'm not here to steal what's yours. I'm here to take back what was always mine and what your father intended me to protect." As murmurs swirled and loyalties shifted, several board members, long wary of Bradley's questionable decisions, began murmuring among themselves. His leadership had always raised quiet suspicions, and now those concerns had a reason to rise to the surface. For the first time, Denise Morgan was no longer invisible. She wasn't a quiet shareholder tucked away in the footnotes of an annual report. She was the majority owner, co-founder, and the person most qualified to protect the company's soul from the very people who had trampled over it for too long. And as the weight of that reality settled over the room, so too did the knowledge that the reckoning had just begun. Just as the board was still reeling from the revelation of Denise Morgan's legal ownership, the atmosphere inside the glass-paneled boardroom took another unexpected turn. With an air of unwavering control, Denise stepped to the head of the table and quietly connected her laptop to the conference screen. The display flickered to life, casting soft blue light across the stunned faces of Falcon Dynamics executives. "I didn't come here just with old documents," she began, her voice calm but resonant. "I came with truth, the kind that's been buried under arrogance, greed, and fraud." The first slide showed a timeline of financial transactions, wire transfers that diverted millions into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, all processed through shell companies masked as consulting firms. Names on the accounts traced back to Bradley Falcon and his closest executives. The room fell into a deep hush as the slides continued. Phantom R&D projects that consumed generous budgets but had no deliverables, ghost employees receiving salaries, and most damning of all, pension funds rerouted to executive bonuses. Then came the payroll records. Denise highlighted them in yellow. "These are the pay cuts imposed on junior staff, right after bonuses were issued to upper management," she said, pausing. "While you were planning to lay off half the workforce, you increased your own luxury travel budget by 40%. A wave of discomfort spread among the board members. Some shifted in their seats, a few looked away. And then, from the far end of the room, a quiet voice cut through the silence. Victor Shaw, a young accountant in his late 20s, stood up, visibly trembling. "Everything she said is true," he said, swallowing hard. "I was instructed to process those transfers. When I raised questions, I was told to stay quiet or lose my job." Victor pulled out his own folder, emails, internal memos, and personal notes that corroborated Denise's evidence. Bradley ordered every transaction. He used offshore payments to siphon company funds, and the pension raid, he called it a necessary reallocation. "I couldn't be complicit anymore." Gasps erupted around the room. The air thickened with betrayal. Board members turned pale as they digested the extent of corruption. What had once been denial was rapidly turning to fury. Denise didn't gloat. Instead, she turned toward the head of the table and said clearly, "I move to immediately suspend Bradley Falcon from his role as CEO. I also propose to cancel all planned layoffs and begin a full independent audit of the company's financial activities for the past 10 years. The motion was met with silence for several seconds. Then Martha Green, eyes sharp and steady, nodded solemnly. Seconded. A vote was called. Each board member, now visibly rattled, cast their ballot. Some hesitated, but when their pens met the paper, the decision was unmistakable. The tally, 11 in favor, 1 abstention. The result was overwhelming. Bradley, seething, slammed his hand on the table. "You're making a mistake. She doesn't know how to run a company. You're handing it over to someone who's been in the shadows her entire life." Martha stood. "No, Bradley, we're correcting a mistake that's lasted 30 years. Security was summoned. Bradley and his loyalists were escorted out, some with heads bowed, others still snarling under their breath. For the first time, the boardroom was free of his presence. But the battle wasn't over. Within hours of his removal, Bradley launched a blistering counterattack via media outlets and social platforms. Headlines screamed with inflammatory rhetoric: hostile takeover by unknown shareholder, company hijacked in boardroom coup. He appeared on financial talk shows painting Denise as a schemer, a woman who had stayed silent for decades only to ambush the company when it was vulnerable. She's never led a division, never been accountable for a single quarter. This isn't leadership, it's sabotage, he declared. On social media, the storm intensified. Denise was targeted with racist slurs and sexist remarks. Bots flooded platforms with hashtags like #NotMyCEO and #FalconFraud, questioning her credentials, intelligence, and intentions. Memes circulated, depicting her as a thief in a suit. Internally, fear trickled back into the company. Employees already shaken by rumors of layoffs were now unsure if their new leader could steer them through chaos. Was Denise just a vengeful shareholder? A figurehead in a bigger game? Or was she really here to rebuild? Denise didn't retreat. The next morning she convened an all-hands meeting, a rarity for Falcon Dynamics, where leaders typically stayed locked behind office doors. For the first time, Denise addressed the company not as a mystery woman or an outsider, but as the rightful leader. She stood on the modest auditorium stage, no teleprompter, no press, no handlers, just her voice. "I know the last 24 hours have been a whirlwind," she began. "You've heard things, you've read headlines, but I won't let lies shape your future." Then she unveiled everything. The financial truth, the corruption, the audit plan, the vision moving forward, one centered on fairness, innovation, and human dignity. She promised no hidden agendas, no mass layoffs, no more decisions made behind closed doors. "And for those of you wondering who I am," she said finally, "I'm Denise Morgan. I helped build this company before it had a name. I stood by when my name was left off the letterhead, and I stayed when the mission was forgotten. But now I'm here to restore it, not for headlines, not for vengeance, but for you." The room fell into stunned silence. Then a single clap echoed from the back. Victor Shaw stood, applauding. Slowly, others joined, engineers, receptionists, finance clerks. Applause swelled into a standing ovation. That day marked a turning point. Despite the smear campaigns, Denise had won the room that mattered most, the people of Falcon Dynamics. In the weeks following her public address, the energy within Falcon Dynamics shifted like a tide turning. The same halls that once echoed with whispers of doubt and gossip about Denise Morgan now carried a different tone, one of cautious hope. The board, now restructured with new independent members and internal representatives, held an official vote to name Denise as the next CEO. The result was unanimous. After more than 3 decades of silence and sacrifice, the woman who once stood in the shadows was finally at the helm. Denise didn't take a victory lap. Her first act as CEO was to assemble a listening council, comprising employees from all departments, across seniority levels and backgrounds. She walked the factory floors, visited coding pods, and had lunch in the employee cafeteria, not in the executive suite. She asked questions, took notes, and listened with intent. What emerged was a blueprint not just for recovery, but for rebirth. Her reforms came quickly and decisively. She introduced an employee equity plan, granting partial ownership to long-term staff and high-performing new hires, ensuring that the company's success would be shared, not hoarded. She launched the Morgan Initiative, a scholarship and mentorship program for underrepresented youth in STEM, with a special focus on Black and Indigenous students from underserved communities. Applications poured in. For many, it was the first time a Fortune 500 company had opened a real door, not just a PR door, into an industry still shaped by exclusion. Denise also revitalized Falcon's once dormant research division. Under Bradley, innovation had taken a backseat to stock price manipulation and executive perks. Denise reversed that. She reopened labs, rehired laid-off engineers, and established a new future tech incubator that gave small, diverse-led startups a chance to collaborate with Falcon's infrastructure without surrendering their autonomy. Partnerships with universities and public institutions were restored, and within 6 months, the company announced its first major breakthrough in sustainable computing in nearly a decade. Internally, employee morale surged, exit rates dropped, productivity rose, not through fear, but through trust. Denise's leadership style was not performative, but principled. She didn't speak in vague mission statements, she spoke in clear action, and she followed through. Media coverage, once tainted by Bradley's smear campaign, began to shift. Headlines changed from skepticism to admiration. Falcon Dynamics finds its wings under new leadership. From silence to CEO, Denise Morgan's quiet revolution, the face of inclusive innovation. For the first time in its history, Falcon Dynamics wasn't just known for its technology, it was known for its ethics. 1 year to the day since the explosive boardroom meeting, Denise stood on the main stage of the Global Innovation Forum in Berlin. She wore the same understated navy cardigan she'd worn the day she reclaimed her voice. But now, the crowd rose for her, not out of pity or protocol, but out of respect. She wasn't introduced as the first black woman CEO of Falcon Dynamics. She was introduced as one of the most transformative leaders of the decade. In her keynote, Denise didn't talk about herself. She talked about systems and how courage, when matched with accountability, can rebuild what injustice once broke. "I was never invisible," she told the audience. "I was just unacknowledged. And so are millions of others. Until we change that, boardroom by boardroom, classroom by classroom, we haven't done enough." Her words were not just remembered, they were echoed. Back home in Chicago, outside the newly named Denise Morgan Research Center, young engineers and students gathered for internships, workshops, and community programs. On the wall hung a quote from her speech, etched in steel: "Lead like you remember who's been forgotten." Denise Morgan had become more than a CEO. She had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of persistence, not of power, but of principle. Her journey from silence to spotlight was no longer a secret. It was a signal to every person who had been overlooked, doubted, or denied a seat at the table. If you believe stories like Denise's can reshape the world, share this one. Leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and help us spotlight those whose time has finally come. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more Denise Morgans.